today, since we have so many wonderful writers all together, I thought we would take an opportunity to sort of talk about the technology of the novel, all of the different things that it can do, all of the modes it can operate in, and how we see that in all of these different texts. So we'll take a little sort of untraditional approach. We'll have one reading and then some conversation, and then another short reading and then some conversation, and then another short reading and some conversation. So we'll have these texts dancing in between our talk and hopefully illuminate more about the wonderful work that everybody's doing. So with that, Quiara, would you like to start
I would love to.
with a reading?
All right, here we go. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This is my book. It's called The White Hot, and I'll be reading a short passage from it. For those who didn't get to hear me speak yesterday, just a little bit of setup that our narrator, whose name is April, is telling her daughter Noelle, who she refers to as Noe in this passage, about a journey she took. April has been in the woods for a few days, Ohiopyle State Park in western Pennsylvania, and she has met someone, a fellow hiker in the woods. After the candle's completion, I trailed Kamal up the tumbled rocks to the pine-softened yellow trail. A new way, a different course. Sneakers felt invasive, clumsy. All the information the earth had to offer, moisture, dust, leaf texture, resumed its unreadable state. A steep price to pay for protection. I missed the ground. The Ohiopyle branches were barer now than when I'd entered. Wet leaves clung to our shoes as if the storm had left sticky note reminders. Maybe, I thought, the wind had come specifically for me, recognizing, initiating even, a kindred spirit. Kamal had seen destruction in my eyes. And yet as we hiked, I wondered, was there some part of me that no storm could reach? One rock in my shadowed cave that stood ever ready to receive the sun? Eventually, other hikers appeared and nodded hello, pulling dogs aside to let us pass. After 7 miles of sneaker-stepped silence, I was in a different parking lot than the one I'd come in through. Perched on Kamal's trunk, we emptied rocks and dust from our shoes, peeled off socks, and rinsed our feet beneath a jug. A swig from a Nalgene tasted of musty pipes. I asked if that cave had a name. In all his maps, Kamal said, it didn't even get a dot. Should we call it something? Loud place, he said. The throat, I said. We shook our heads, laughed. Nah, a name wouldn't do it all. I can't go back to that unmarked spot, Noe. I've never revisited, but telling you about it, nickels fill my mouth, cool and smooth. It's knocking around inside me still. The soft soles relearning gravity, the choice to follow them as they turn the wrong way, the unmarked path, then the no path at all, that is, until my own feet press the dirt down. Stray, Noe, stray.
Thank you, wonderful. Beautiful. So as you mentioned, Quiara, this passage and much of the book is a direct address, a kind of epistolary address between mother and daughter. And I thought that this could maybe open us all to talk about something that I think about so much when I write, which is what is the angle of audience in your work? How do you think of who the work is addressed to, and therefore, what the book should say in order to address itself to that audience? Did writing an epistolary novel kind of govern what you wrote and how you wrote? Did it pressurize the text in a way that changed something in the way you work?
Well, as I mentioned yesterday, I've mostly spent my life in writing as a playwright. Mm-hmm. I think that's how you first encountered my writing, and
I have reviewed you. It's true.
yes.
It was great, I think. I loved it.
Thank you. And I mentioned that one of the constant technical considerations of writing in the theater is that the words and the visuals have to reach all the way to the back row of the theater. And so it's an art form that really requires projection and rewards projection, and subtlety has to find its way into that consideration. So I think this being my first novel, published at age 48, when I already knew kind of what I was doing as a playwright, but really had no idea what I was doing as a novelist, the opportunity to really whisper directly in the reader's ear was sacred to me. I'd never had the opportunity to whisper as a writer. And so very briefly toyed with doing it in third person, but I thought, no, I want this, this mother is gonna be directly addressing her daughter. And so, yeah, just really leaning in to that opportunity. You heard her telling her daughter, stray. This is a letter written to a daughter on the daughter's 18th birthday, explaining why the mom abandoned her. We know that from the beginning. It's not a spoiler. And to be honest, at age 48, I'm the oldest child of parents who came from Puerto Rico, so I'm the first in the family born here. All of those things led to me being a people pleaser, living a very kind of dutiful life, and as I've joked, like even my rebellion would have artistic merit, you know, like I would be the good girl, and I think at a certain...
I'm gonna write a play, Mom.
That's right.
You can't stop me from the theater.
So I think I was just ready in my life to just really challenge myself to put that aside. Why am I constantly trying to please, trying to honor a community, which I've dedicated a lot of my writing years to? And I said, this one's just gonna be for me. And so I purposefully chose the most unlikable character possible so that I couldn't even attempt to deal with the likability issue. She abandons her daughter when her daughter's 10 years old. That's the story. Yeah. And just leaning into that and that direct address of that was a way for me to kind of challenge my own personal and spiritual muscles as they'd kind of atrophied into this like likability trap.
But part of that is, you know, even the most unlikable character, if they're writing a letter to somebody else, it's intrinsic in the idea that they still might have something to teach, right? And I'm wondering about, Maurice, I wonder if you have, thought about this as well, like the didactic dimensions of the novel, that it has something to relay to future generations, and whether that plays a part in your work as well.
Oh, thank you for that. Wow, the stage is so high. I feel like we're like being sacrificed to the Aztecs or something.
We're not going to read it yet. Not read it.
No, I'm not going to.
Okay.
But wait, I said Aztec. Is it too soon to make fun of the Aztecs?
No.
It depends on which Aztec, as always. It's just about individuals, not groups.
Books are objects. They're still laughing at that. I'm going to kill them. No. Books are objects, but when I was writing this book in particular, I was thinking about it in terms of sacred mythologies, this idea of what is truth and what is myth. If you go back in time past a certain point, everything is mythology. America, for example, we have the idea of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, which is a kind of sacred mythology. Nobody thinks it actually happened anymore, but it tells us about ourselves. So in writing this book, which is, it's a simple concept. It's a girl during slavery times in the South. You've heard that story. It's a tale told 1,000 times. But I wanted to stir in a little extra stuff. I'm from New Orleans, so gumbo has a lot of components to it. And so even the idea that I added in these sort of inserts and I put an epilogue into it, spoiler, I was just basically just cribbing from, actually it was Rachel Kushner who said, I love Rachel so much. Just steal, don't apologize for it.
Yeah,
so
that's my policy.
Exactly. So a top 3 book for me is Handmaid's Tale. I've always loved that book. I've read it 3, 4, 5 times. If you recall in that book, it flash forwards at some point at the very end, a couple of 100 years, and it's looking back at this kind of failed nation and saying, what a bunch of idiots, what a bunch of maroons, So in writing this, I had that same sort of flavor. I think about my own female ancestors and what they went through and how, I could probably do research and tell you what the mayor of New Orleans was doing like what he had for breakfast in like 1860, you know? But in terms of like what my great-great-grandmother times 7 was doing, it's very mysterious. But in knowing my mother, knowing my grandmother, knowing my aunties and people in the family, I could speculate and take that sort of Sadia Hartman idea of, you know, reaching out and have these sort of constructive archives and mythologies. I just think it's important for us to do that because we're getting to the point with AI where nothing is real anymore. I mean, maybe this is all, you know, AI. I can't really tell.
They look pretty real. I checked it out. They're rendering very well on the screen. Yeah, yeah. Bushra, how about you? Is that this idea of transmission part of what fuels your work as well?
What fuels my work? So my book is about a Muslim girl growing up in Queens in the 80s who doesn't realize at first that she's gay, but then slowly through the novel comes to realize that. And I really wanted to explore a time when there was nothing out there for a person to see to understand why they felt so different from everyone, you know? And it was really important for me to write a narrative where the Muslim child is both in touch with her divine spirituality that comes from her religion, but also fully loves herself as a queer person. That those things do not have to be at odds for themselves. So if there's any kind of teaching, if there's so much in here, but if there was one thing that I wanted people to get is that queerness is divine, and that one can have a relationship, if you're Muslim, if you're any religion, with the divine and whatever your sexuality is.
Yeah, well, there's such a funny passage in your book where one of the uncles is like sort of teaching the others about Christianity. He's like, "Oh, Easter, that's when Jesus goes upstate." You know, there's that like, you know, that even sort of comparative religion comparisons among religions happen in this sort of like we teach each other in this kind of streetwise way. Quiara, before we move on to another topic, I saw you perk up when I said the thing about like still having something to teach, even an imperfect narrator. I wanted to give you space to address that too.
I love that question because, of course, we've all learned from the books that have taught us. And as in my book, in The White Hot, she explains to her daughter, look, happy birthday, you're 18 today. Haven't seen you since you were 10 when I abandoned you, as you well remember. I'm not writing for forgiveness. I'm not even going to apologize because you deserve better than that. But I do think I've learned some things that might be of value to you. So just hear me out. And that notion comes from a lot of places in my life, but one kind of directly that I stole it from is Frankenstein, this notion of, you know, don't forgive me, just hear me. And every time I read those passages in Frankenstein, I cry like a baby because we're very caught up in this narrative of guilt and innocence in this nation. But what the creation is arguing for there is, I'm not so interested in categories of guilt and innocence, but I do have a story. And it will benefit all of us that I tell it and that you listen. And so that's what the mother is saying in the story. Look, I learned some things about being a woman. Maybe you could find merit in that, even if it's rejecting those things. And when I was reading, so my editor started throwing me books to read, and some of them were rereads, like Beloved. Some of them, I had never read Autobiography of My Mother by Jamaica Kincaid.
Great book.
All of these books on kind of scorned women who were unapologetically living lives that were experiments in freedom. And it was this kind of syllabus I got that came really late in life, and they had learned these things already, and they were teaching me, and I felt I wanted to add to that kind of lesson that existed out in the world about how to be a woman and really make your life an experiment in freedom, and an experiment that usually came with a real cost.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that sounds to me like a metaphor for how every human generation relates to the people of the future. It says, you know, I'm sorry I left you this ravaged planet. I'm sorry there's fascism now. I played a part. And yet, here's what it was like to be alive. And there's something sacred in that transmission, no matter how, you know, imperfect, how scrambled the signal. With that, though, maybe, Bushra, I would love for you to read.
Okay.
And then we can kind of proceed from there.
Yeah. And thank you so much for stepping in. And thank you for everyone. I'm going to talk tomorrow, so I'm going to save a lot of my thank yous for tomorrow too, but I'm happy to be here. I'm going to read from a later part in the book, and this chapter is called Taibanti. Angela and I learned to rest our heads on each other's shoulders on our Friday train rides to Queens. We acted as if we were two friends, tired from a grueling day at school. Two girls who looked like they could be sisters, but who lived by listening to the steady thump-thump of each other's blood. We held hands under our sweaters or book bags, not caring if they got sweaty. Sometimes people raised their eyebrows at us. Then we shifted away, pretended we were friends. We'd been hearing about attacks on the train and went more and more to the West Village to escape. And I should say again, this is taking place in the 80s. One afternoon, I was resting my head on Angela's shoulder. All around, the sounds of the train, the bing-bong of the subway doors chimed, bringing me to the edge of sleep. I thought of Adam and Eve. Eve had been created from Adam's ribs. It's what my mother had taught me. Didn't it make sense then for two ribs to come together the way ribs really did? I saw Angela and me, with bleeding hearts in between our rib bones, the kind of hearts I used to see on the Loteria playing cards they sold in the bodega. When the bloody heart started beating, I realized I was falling asleep, and I woke with a start. We were at Queensboro Plaza. Angela smiled. I was just going to wake you up. I'm getting off. But I didn't want her to go. I'll wait with you. Sometimes I waited at Queensboro Plaza where the N and 7 train met on the platform. I'd stay on the N train until the N train arrived and then take the 7 home. We got off, jumping back, letting the long, roaring worm of the 7 flash away with one last blast of heat. It was muggy on the platform, sweltering. After the frigidness of the subway, the heat was an insult. My face became sticky. I fanned my t-shirt and my jeans stuck uncomfortably to my thighs. All the beautiful people of Queens were wilting on the platform. Come on. I pulled Angela behind a dark green rusty pillar plastered with subway advisories, spelling out the delays for the rest of the week. It's so hot, she said, but she didn't pull away. Ever since we started spending time in the West Village, we'd become bold. I kissed her. The silver glint of the building shone on us with mirror heat. Our atoms collided into each other. I felt Angela's heart beating against my chest. She tasted of peach, vanilla, mystic, and mint. A cicada perched somewhere close on a tree overhanging the plaza sang. Out of nowhere, I smelled baby powder. And then I heard a gasp. Matter realigned itself, and I turned in slow motion. It was my Taiba auntie. Her face was wooden, her mouth a grim line. Angela and I instinctively jumped away from each other. Angela dropped my hand, but the stickiness from where our fingers had intertwined clung to my skin. Had she seen us? Had she seen us? The question hammered through my head. Terror burned in my throat like vomit. Every sense in my being sharpened. Assalamu alaikum, auntie, I said in my calmest voice possible. I let my reputation stand behind me. All the years of being the perfect Muslim daughter, reading all my namazes and Quran, the only one from the neighborhood who'd gone into Stuyvesant, I pulled my disguise over me like an invisible shield. Wa alaikum assalam, she said to me while staring at Angela. She took in Angela's 9-inch nails t-shirt, her dark raspberry lipstick, the ring in her nose, and the black eyeliner that turned in a swirl at the end. Taiba auntie sniffed, and in that sniff was everything. Hello, Angela said, never one to be ignored. In the distance, we heard the rumble of the train. The track curved, and for a moment, we wouldn't know if it was the 7 or the N. I smelled the sour smell of garbage. I smelled Taiba auntie's baby powder smell, and I began to gasp for breath. The 7 roared into the station, and Taiba auntie moved quickly. Drama or no drama, she was going to get a seat. When I didn't move, she looked back at me. Aren't you going home? It wasn't a question. Angela and I exchanged looks. We both knew I needed to go. When I still didn't move, Taiba auntie said, come on, Razia. Of course, I had the ability to turn the other way, to resist, to do anything but follow her. But when Taiba auntie spoke, I was lifted with such force off my feet, I floated to her side. There was a thin rope from her worn-out hands to mine, a rope made from centuries of tradition. Plus, I knew the moves I made in the next few minutes would decide everything. I need to convince Taiba auntie she hadn't seen what she'd seen. I need to make sure I got to my mother first. I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. I wondered if we could move the conversation to the capability that the novel has, maybe not, exclusively, but certainly in a very intense and particular way, to describe place, I too grew up in New York. It was in Manhattan, and it was a different train, but I know what you're talking about. Right. And I wonder, Bushra, what does place, and I know you've talked about Corona in more than one of your books, what does place activate in your work? And specific to how you even introduced your book earlier, like how does place then activate other dimensions, the spirit, the theological, other dimensions that you want to get at in the work?
Well, I grew up in Corona, which is it's a under-resourced community in Queens, and I felt like other people who would drive through Corona would just see our poverty and the dirt and the graffiti, but I loved it so much. It was just so home to me, and so what I started to do is use language to really show people how beautiful it was. So everything I write about Corona is just filled with lines of poetry. I was sharing this with someone. I'm also a poet who writes novels, and so I'm a proet. And I looked it up, and this is actually not a word yet, so we are now coining a word right here.
We just learned from Arlo that this will also live forever, this record. So if anybody else tries to claim it, sorry.
They have proof. It's recorded. It's on the website. But then the only closest thing I could find is proet was a version of an Italian verb that meant to bring forth. And so I really, really wanted to use language to share the beauty of the neighborhood, to share what it was like to grow up in an immigrant community. As you know, we are deeply under attack right now, just to show the relationships. And actually, it's one reason I loved Quiara's work. I was saying last night that my daughter and I watch In the Heights all the time. We watched it like hundreds of times because I want to show her what my neighborhood was like, although it's a different neighborhood, because it doesn't exist in the same way anymore. As you know, as a New Yorker, things change.
Things change, and we want to sort of encase them in some way. If you can't access it physically, hopefully, the book can contain some of its essence, which it so wonderfully does. Maurice, you have in the contemporary and also in the historical accessed and dug deep into New Orleans as a place. Has that investigation been part of your mission to say, here is a place and in all of its grandeur, terror, history, and present, all of that? Has place been a kind of anchoring presence in your work?
Yeah, a mixture of things. As you were saying, this idea that people may see one thing when they look at it, but it's really something else. And who was at the talk, the panel, me and Jamie Attenberg on, I think it was Monday night? Anybody was there for that? Yeah, clap for us. Clap for Jamie. She had to fly back to New Orleans. But this idea we talked about of New Orleans being like a fantasy place. And there's different ways of looking at that. If you look at an ad, it's just like a dude playing a trumpet, which is evoking Louis Armstrong. But I'm from New Orleans. I've been there my entire life, and all my people are from that place. And so in trying to tell stories about the people, how to put this in a broad way, if you think about, for example, slave narratives, so 12 Years a Slave, the TV show, the series Roots, oftentimes people in those narratives are seen as one-dimensional victims who are always on their heels playing defense. Even in my first book, I had that kind of attitude towards my character, who is a black man in the future dealing with racism in America. But with this latest book, I had the opposite idea. Looking at my mother and others and going, they wouldn't just take it. And I'd done research for years where I uncovered documents. The most important thing I discovered was that even though the Confederates were fighting like hell across the South, to quote, fighting like hell, to quote that guy in the White House, they fought in Atlanta, they fought in Mississippi, but in New Orleans they didn't fight for some strange reason. And it was a historical mystery to me why they didn't fight. And I even met some actual Confederates, neo-Confederates defending the statues in New Orleans. I'd ask these guys, why didn't the guys fight in New Orleans? And we don't know why they didn't fight.
Those sound like lovely conversations.
Look, that's a whole nother panel, man. Let me tell you.
Me and the neo-KKK.
Oh, my goodness.
Just asking questions,
Yes, absolutely. But the short answer being they didn't have any answers, but the answers was in between the lines of the text. And what was in between the lines of the text was pretty straightforward. If I could teleport and meet my great-grandmother times 7, with the attitudes of the ladies in my family, in my bloodline, there's all these mysterious debts of masters and masters and accountants and politicians. They're just grounding up glass and putting in their grits. And
Yeah.
these guys, they're not surviving very long, you see? So something was happening there, and that sort of sparked off this idea of resistance. Again, Handmaid's Tale. And you know, in today's society, we need a little bit of gumption, a little bit of backbone to fight what's happening in this country right now.
Yeah. Damn right. Quiara, I guess I have the same question for you about Philadelphia. You know, there's, you know, lots of mentions of the SEPTA and sort of local landmarks in your novel, and I wonder, you know, whether, interestingly, it's sort of in motion, because The White Hat is, among other things, kind of like a novel of it's like a road novel, too. You know, there's a sort of Kerouacian element to it. Amtrak comes into it, but I wonder whether place unlocked things for you as well.
Yeah, I think I'm still carrying with me this misperception I had growing up in West Philly and North Philly. West Philly was a more black and white part of the city, but it has, you know, just the architecture of a neighborhood and a community determines so much. And so the block where I grew up in West Philly has these large old Victorian twin homes that were pretty much ramshackle in my childhood. And so it was starter homes for immigrant families that had newly arrived, that were large families. And then in North Philly was really the seat of the Puerto Rican community, the Philly Rican community. And I spent a lot of time there because, you know, Abuela's house is the daycare place, and you know, Auntie Ginny's house is the daycare place. And I had this misconception growing up because it was such a vibrant, loud, volume 11 neighborhood that it was that it was a universe. And as I kind of, in my adolescence, strayed farther and farther out into broader Philadelphia and then the broader world, I was really shocked to learn that, you know, we were less than 2% of Philadelphia's community. The Puerto Rican community. Like, I got to college and there was this big New Yorican contingent, and I was there like, yeah, we're as big as they are, and they're like, oh no, honey. And I looked up the stats. So I come from this like tiny, huge place, and one of the things I started realizing was that like we had the goods, like we had stuff that they didn't have, and that they would benefit from. And so part of that kind of teaching mission was for us, you know, let's show them what we got.
Yeah.
But also for them, let's help them benefit from what they say they don't care to hear and listen to. Very Philly, fourth most segregated city in the nation.
Yeah.
But I was determined to share some of our good news with the world. And so that, you know, the map of that segregated city, and then moving out into a broader place and reflecting on the small gems, that remains in my work. And I do want to flip it. The other thing I think about with location is I assume other people have this experience where, like, I remember the places I was when I read each of your work. And I think when as readers, like, okay, porch looking out at the hill, porch looking out at the hill, driving to pick up my son from school. So I listened to Great Expectations.
I was about to say, that's unsafe. That's not, I don't think that's legal. But okay, you listen.
You know, and you know, I remember the first time I read Go Tell It on the Mountain. I was in a center seat on my first flight to California as an adult. I was getting paid to fly somewhere. This is amazing. And I was weeping between two strangers. And I think that thing about reading, it helps us see our current location and feel it in a new way. It stops, where we are located right now stops being stale by virtue of someone else kind of mapping their life on us.
Yeah. I mean, well, and just to sort of bring things back quickly to the theme of the whole proceedings, the festival, that is a certain kind of attention, the physical, embodied, attentive posture that happens when reading, that the sort of constant liquidity of the screen and the digital cannot provide. You know, that there's something about reading that does, like, sort of reacquaint you with your physical self, like the body, the mind as a part of the physical world that I think is perhaps unique, you know. Bushra, before we move on, I do want to just mention, because I'm just thinking New York, New Orleans, Philadelphia, these are great American cities. And of course there are novels of the rural that I love, but there is a way to piggyback off of what Quiara was saying about sort of, yes, segregation, but also how like adjacency becomes a place to like sort of gives the opportunity for us to come together and
Right.
to sort of transmit ideas. It seems to me that the 80s Queens that you're describing is, among other things, like a sort of religious commons. Like people are bringing their own ideologies, their theologies, their ideas of God and of other people into a kind of commons and learning through that adjacency. I wonder if that, was part of your, first of all, your experience of growing up, but also one of the things, the other kind of commons is the novel. It is a kind of collage of ideas that you can sort of litter across the text. I wonder if that was part of your...
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing is, people say it's a melting pot, but it's really more like the bobo iced tea, where everyone has their like bubbles. But then in public school, all the bubbles kind of come together and break open. And I think that's why, children are so amazing. Children can teach us, like in public schools, all of us kids would get along, right? And our parents would be like, oh no, don't go there, and there was a lot of like, fear between communities. But I feel like in public school, we would all come together. There's another book I did really quickly called Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism. And my friend Daisy Hernandez, we were doing it during 9/11, like right after 9/11. And we felt that really turned New York City into a city we didn't recognize, right? Where people were fearful of each other and neighbors were not helping each other necessarily in the same way. If you were Muslim, I should say, they were helping each other if they weren't, but they were not helping you if you were Muslim. And so we wanted that book to be like another coming together because it was like people from like all different backgrounds in the same book. And I also want to make one point too, because I had to end this chapter at a certain part for the reading, but what actually happens in that scene, and I'm okay to give a spoiler because it's been 3 years, is the auntie actually comes out to her. So nice. The auntie is actually like, we all have girlfriends. And we're like, what? She's like, what? She's like, everyone does that in school, but then you have to get married. And it was just, it was just like this thing that, so I felt like, in New York City, you all start bumping into people when you're least expected. Yeah. The worst times. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up too.
Girlfriends for All is a platform I can get behind. That is Medicare and then girlfriend. But so as we keep on going, Maurice, I'd love to hear you read.
Yeah, what is that saying? Everybody needs a wife, even wives?
No. There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
amen.
Yeah, right. That's my platform is Vinson's VP. By the way, if you've never heard Vinson's wonderful podcast with Naomi and what is it, Alex?
And Alex Schwartz.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Critics
Check it
at
out.
large.
Any fans of the podcast? Anybody out there? Yeah, a few people. Thanks, of course, to Arlo and President Nancy and Mark and Michael and Ben and Sleepy and Dopey and no, I'm kidding. See, just make sure you're awake. That's part of what I have to do. So I'm going to read a very short excerpt from this. To quote Betty Davis, you're in for a bumpy ride. But I had mentioned with Jamie the other night at the panel that this is probably inspired by her. My first book was a lot inspired by both Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Lolita by Nabokov, which was those were like very sort of masculine text. And I was using like a lot of my own sort of inner, whatever to make that. And she said, Maurice, with your next novel, like do something that's humble. Like be less of like less toxic masculinity, a little bit less of that. And so this book is written from the point of view of a young woman who's been enslaved. And I'm using the conventions that you often see. It's not a spoiler. This is 50 pages in. There's always a part in these narratives where they say it's time to get the hell out of here and try and escape from their enslavers. And so the last point is that I love melodrama. So I moseyed on over to the Tropic Cinema and I saw a song sung blue with Hugh Jackman and Kate Hudson. Haven't seen it, fantastic. When it hits Tubi, my mother's gonna love it. She's gonna lose her mind. Okay. All right, so all you have to know is that this scene, they've escaped New Orleans. They're in the swamps west of New Orleans, and this is what happens. What was that? I hear it too, Mama, Adi whispered. It's just one of him, Sanit said through clenched teeth. I was fine to let him be. But he didn't follow us this far. He up to no good. As if called into being, A white man in muddy pantaloons walked past. Say nothing, Sunit said. Stay here. Adi saw that same firmness in her mother's eyes from that night she waited for Dumarche with the knife in her hand, but this time she wasn't thinking through whether to move on it. Sunit stood up and walked onto the path behind the man. When Sunit was within arm's length, Adi saw her mother produce that sharp knife, and the sight of that sharp dagger caused Adi's mouth to fly open. Adi's surprise manifested in a small escaped sound. The man wheeled around and threw a punch that seemed to go through Sunit's face. Sunit and the man struggled arm in arm, body over body, first standing and then on the ground. The man's paleness flashed in the dusk, his belly like that of a fish. He and Sunit tussled until he got his arm around Sunit's neck. Sunit had dropped the knife and was calling out for help. Adi wasn't sure if she was calling for her or for the weapon. Birds flew wild in the canopy, furred animals rooted in the foliage and made for their own escapes. Her mother was slapping the man's arms, but this changed nothing at all. He just grunted and pulled his arm tighter around Sunit's neck. Adi threw herself at the man. He knocked her backward. What to do, Mama? What to do? Sunit grunted. She wasn't sure what her mother had just said, but there on the black dirt, the edge of the object twinkling like a jewel, Sunit's short knife, all of a sudden she could hear her mother's garbled language. His stomach, go for his stomach. She brought the knife down and it glanced off. She brought it down again, and this time with her tightened grip, the warmth of blood about her hands, the same smell as the butcher's, and the man yelled, God! Adi dropped the knife, rolled free, and sat on her behind, holding her own throat. Adi ran to her mother and hugged her. Thank you. Sunit was gasping, her voice raspy, as she held Adi close. Thank you, daughter. And the man, for his part, spoke, but Adi didn't understand him. It didn't care to understand him. And shortly thereafter, that man was silent forevermore. Thank you.
Woo! Wow.
We're talking about all the things that the novel can do. The novel cannot usually have a soundtrack like that. When the beat kicked in at first, I was like, oh, I'm having my own personal stroke. Yeah. This is it. But then, that was incredible. With the 5 minutes that we have left before we get to Q&A, I would like to ask you, Maurice, one of the things that you do so well in this book is intervene in history, and I think that this is another thing that the novel can do. Not everybody is riveted by history class, but what the novel can do is say, no, in these histories there are stories, there is suspense, there are scenes and sort of folds of action that would otherwise sort of just be lost to the great, whatever, maw of time. I wonder how the urge to historicize plays in your mind.
Oh, sure, that's a wonderful question, Vincent. I mean, look, that sort of thing, we'll back up for a second. We all come from other places. You know, none of our ancestors were here unless you were like, 110% Native American, something like that. And so we know historically that in every community there are marginalized communities, and those people are denigrated. They are called stupid and slow and ugly and smelly and poor and, on and on and on. In these moments, a scene like that probably did happen. And if somebody had either written it out back in the day when it happened to them or they had communicated it orally, that story's not transmitted. The New York Times in 1860 is not going to publish that in the paper of record in that time period. So I can avenge my ancestors. The same way you can avenge your ancestors, whether they're Italian or German or Irish or whatever. It's that same vibe. It's just trying to give them their due because we all deserve to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the ways that we sort of go back and historicize or rehistoricize is also to re-engage literature. Quiara has a great passage in The White Hot where where the main character is looking back at an old paper of hers, and it's like, why Siddhartha sucks. A sort of a work of criticism in the mind of the narrator, sort of doing a kind of critical history. Bushra, you mentioned how Corona is often talked about as like a place of ashes and whatever. You actually quote that characterization in The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
And sort of reinscribing place that's already been kind of written by somebody else and saying, no, there's other stuff here. Is that, for you, Bushra, I guess we'll go first, how did you think of, not only as a record of place, but as a sort of rehistoricizing as well?
I think, well, so going back into, well, she's a reader. The character is a reader. Mm-hmm. So whenever she's interacting with books in which there's any reference to Corona anywhere, like in The Great Gatsby, he calls it the Valley of Ashes when he's driving past it. I'm also looking at the rehistory of the 80s, and what it was like to live in the shadow of the AIDS epidemic, what it was like to be a child at that time, what it was like to live in a time when, again, there were no queer role models. Like George Michael was in the closet, Whitney Houston was in the closet. Even with Boy George, everyone would be like, no, he's not gay. There was like this way. So like, look back on this time in history where if you were a young queer youth, like, everyone was like, no, this doesn't exist, whether it's in mainstream American culture or in the home. So to really look back on what that felt like, I really was delving into that, like when there was no language for it. And at some point her mother takes her to an exorcist because she's having nightmares, and a Muslim exorcist, and he says, oh, you're different. And she feels like, oh my God, how does he know I'm different? I don't even know why I'm different.
Yeah. Quiara, and this will be my last question before we hear other people's questions. You mentioned the theater earlier, and I often wonder, because the theater has such a specific stance vis-a-vis history. It has always been a place where communities, civilizations come together and reinterpret, whether it's the Trojan War, whatever it is, reinterpret important marks, important points in their history. I wonder if you found new dimensions of that capability in the novel as opposed to on the stage.
I think my early education in theater was twofold, and it didn't happen in a theater. One was that was the spiritual context of my youth, which was my mother was a santera, a kind of honored practitioner of Lukumi, what's commonly known as Santeria, but this is a living room practice. And so she gathered and led ceremonial observances in our living room, which were beautiful, intense, very adult sometimes, and I would sometimes be scared and watch from the landing, and I would sometimes participate and kind of be in awe in these presences. And then so to me, we're gathering in a space, we're held in captive time, we're sharing oral histories. It's not 100% unlike theater. And then the other one is that my aunt Linda Hudes composed the score for the Big Apple Circus for 20 years.
Wow.
And she taught me how to read music, and so she would have me come up to New York when they were rehearsing, and I'd be her page turner. And so I would see her rehearse the timing of the clown act, and like when the horn would hit in relation to that sort of thing, and the acrobats. And so this like really kind of sacred and profane. Mm-hmm. This to me was theater. And then I went to actual theater and saw that it was about like wealthy white people arguing while they got drunk. And I was like, oh, that's disappointing.
Somebody breaks a plate and it's all about their divorce.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've strayed now and I've completely forgot where we were. But yeah, that's where it ended.
That's a beautiful place for us to end, yeah. Okay, well, let's go to the audience for a bit. I think we've got maybe a little bit less than 10 minutes, but we can get some questions in.
If you have a question, please rise and we'll bring the mic to you.
A question over here.
This is a question for Maurice. I'm about 20 pages away from the end of your book, and you may reveal this. You may reveal this at the end. But my question is: was this resistance movement all a part of your imagination, or did you base it on any family history or anything that you read that you know is factual? I'm Diane.
Hey, Diane, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. Okay, let me put some context here. I sort of alluded to this earlier. If George Washington broke a nail while crossing, what was the Potomac, whatever he was doing, we would know about that, right? Every little thing he does, we know about. If you are from a minority community, whatever that community is, even the biggest acts are covered up. So, for example, we know this now, that Harriet Tubman was actually in the Army. She was a spy. Some say she was a colonel. Some say she was a general. But she was being paid. She had a pension from the military. Now, that happened back in the 1860s, but it wasn't accepted until very recently. If you do any research at all, you read Isabel Wilkerson, you read Imani Perry, you read Sadia Hartman, any of these people, they bring out so many things. And as you look at, for example, I don't know, Isabel talking about the Lower South, Imani doing like Washington down to New Orleans, think about Sadia doing sort of the Eastern Seaboard, you see all this acts of resistance happening over and over again. I mean, we know about, for example, Dred Scott. That's a big one, Dred Scott. If you read slave narratives, you begin hearing things over and over again. Master told me to do this, but I did that. So-and-so. One thing that I did in the book, you've already passed this point. There's a bit in the book where her master asked her to order some iron chains to cross the Mississippi River, 10 chains, because in real life, the Confederate wanted to stop the Union Navy by putting chains across it. So he says, yeah, order, she's like, yeah, master, how many chains you want? He says, Adi, he calls her, by some French name, something like that. Go ahead and order 10 chains. So she writes down 10 chains because she's literate, and then when he walks away, she scratches out the 0. So she orders 1 chain. Now, in real life, the Union Navy came up the river and broke through the chains. Why? Because of this resistance, this sort of spy network. So were they real or not, who can say? But we know that we humans all have the capacity to fight back in subterranean ways. So I'm just taking that from across all of the human experience and some documentation and some imagination. Yeah.
Do we have another? I think I saw a tentative up here.
Thousands of hands are up.
Hi. My question, you guys talked about place a lot in terms of setting, but I wonder how place affects, like while you're writing, being in the place like that holds so much if it's where your story's taking place.
Yeah.
If that makes sense?
Yeah, I'll start with
Bushra,
that.
yeah.
I mean, I felt like I use photography a lot. I know there's amazing photographers in the audience too. Because I knew, like, as a New Yorker, I couldn't just sit somewhere and stare at someone or someplace for too long. So I would just like walk around and like take quick photos of things that I wanted to write about. I rode the same subways, like that scene. It was like when I, as an adult, rode the subway and realized, like, oh yeah, there's that curve right there. Oh yeah, the 7 and the N meet there. So I fell back in love with so many parts of New York City that I had experienced as a teenager while writing this novel. So for me, it was like actually going back to those places.
Yeah, briefly, I'll just say that I am a native New Orleanian. I had never spent more than about 3.5 weeks outside of my city till I was 40-something years old. My first novel, my second book, my story collection were written while I was in the city the entire time. I felt like this ancient Greek myth, Atlas, is Hercules versus the giant Atlas, and Atlas's weakness is that if he gets his feet off the ground, he loses his power. I was afraid of leaving my city, and I got to go to Ole Miss and be the John Grisham writer in residence for about a year, and that's when I was writing American Daughters, and I was so afraid, and it went very poorly at first. One night, super fast version of the story, the house I was staying in was basically attacked by local policemen. They said that they were like doing an exercise. I'm a black man in John Grisham's old house, Lord knows. That night I had a nightmare about a woman sitting at the kitchen island with a knife in her hand to protect her 2 kids upstairs. And that was the genesis of this book. Being outside my native city, which is majority African American, I've always felt safe and empowered, and being in rural North Mississippi changed something in me. And I could see my own city more clearly, the sort of power in this spy network / community, you see? Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned place with reading, Quiara. Does a similar power correspond to where you are when you write?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm the outlier in that I don't live in Philadelphia anymore, and I left the city when I was a teenager and have lived back there briefly, but basically left and then began writing about it. And I can't, when I go stay with my mom, I can't write at her house. I can't write in the city. And I think it's, I recognize a pattern in that because I used to love hearing their stories from the farms in Puerto Rico, and they would tell those stories in Philadelphia. And they were, before I went to Puerto Rico, I couldn't even imagine the kind of landscapes they were talking about. And so I'm used to the cadence of we tell stories about the place we are not anymore. And so that I'm kind of following that tradition, like I'm telling the story about the place I am not anymore.
Wonderful. We have maybe
One more.
one last. I see in way back to our left, yeah. We've got another very loud audience member, but that is just my baby, so don't.
So this is a question I think any of you could be to any of you. And it's, I listen to books, sometimes it's audio, sometimes I read them. Just depends what I can get a hold of. And do you have, when a book goes to audio, do you have any license to say who would read that book? And also, do you have a vision in your mind of the voice? Because I find it really affects how I hear the story. The voice that tells it can really take me to that place that the story's set.
I don't know about others, but at first I wanted to read my own book, and then they did very kindly. Well, first of all, I should say, and they were like okay with it, and then I decided I didn't want to because I'm not a professional at that. People are paid to do that, so maybe they should do it. But then they sent me samples of people that had like sort of read half a chapter, I guess a kind of audition, and let me have a say. I don't know how that worked for the rest of it.
Yeah, we're the same publisher. I think it's a similar process where they send you the samples, these amazing actors. It's very simple. You get like 3 to say 7 samples, different actors. And I will like pick my favorite one, and then I'll share it with my wife. We've been together for 28 years, and then she'll pick her favorite, and we'll go with that one.
We all need that wife. We all need a wife.
Such a simple process.
Yes, you have a
There you go.
What does her wife say? That's a good question.
I'll add something because I think it's a great question for the writers. I really, read that contract they give you, because I did make sure I had consulting and who read my audio. And in the end, I auditioned to read my own audiobook. I had to audition against other actors. But I did end up reading my own audiobook, and it was important to me because there's so many languages in this book, and I know 5 of them, so not fluently, but like I could at least pronounce the words properly. And so I knew that I didn't know anyone else who might know all those same languages in the same way, and so. Yeah, that's why I did pass that audition. It's the only audition I've ever
I just want
passed.
Michael B. Jordan to play me in the documentary of me writing my next book. I get that. I don't care who's reading the book.
I have,
Yeah.
my first prose book was a memoir published a handful of years ago about my girlhood in Philadelphia between languages. So I read that because it was my story. For this one, I had the benefit of working for 25 years in the theater, so I asked my longtime collaborator, Daphne Rubin Vega, if she would read it. She's very used to my work. She's originated like 5 of my roles.
She's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and she's just got this, she's what I want to sound like. She's got this smoky kind of rock and roll, rebellious voice that I thought would bring a whole nother angle and different experience to the White Hot.
Beautiful. Quiara, Maurice, Bushra, thank you so much.
Thank you, Vinson.
Everybody, thank you.